Thanks for the recording, Sarah. Well, we'll now unmute the lines so that everyone can speak. And as Sarah noted, you're being recorded now. And let's unmute the lines. Okay, whoever wants to speak, please introduce yourself.
Hey, this is Tiffany from the city of Santa Cruz, and we don't have disadvantaged communities in Santa Cruz, so the Cal Enviro screen only shows us low-income communities. So we actually conducted our own social vulnerability to climate change assessment, building a social vulnerability score based on incidents of poverty, elderly, disability, English not spoken as a first language, and crime, and then ranked them relative to one another. We then overlaid our climate hazard zones to understand where are the drivers of social vulnerability coinciding with our climate hazard areas, and have really just begun to scratch the surface on how can we utilize that information going forward to better tailor our adaptation strategies. Springboarding off that, we've also started to engage more deeply with our underrepresented communities. I think I mentioned on the last call, we've hired a liaison officer to help us reach our Spanish-speaking community and our low-income community, and have invited those folks to come in and take a look at how we're structuring our outreach and asking them to tell us what is the best way to talk to your community in terms of time of the day, the type of event, and help us to structure the agenda for the objectives we need to achieve to make sure that your community is engaged. And we're at the start of that with our 2 Resilient Coast projects right now.
Thanks, Tiffany. Can I ask what department is leading that within City of Santa Cruz?
That would be me in the city manager's office.
City manager's office. Okay, thank you. That's important
Hi,
to know.
Tiffany.
Tiffany.
Yeah.
Tiffany. Jack Webster from Marin. You conducted your own survey. Hi. You conducted your own survey. Was that based on census data or other data that you might have?
Everything except for our localized crime data was census data. Our police department keeps crime data in a GIS database, and so we utilize that as well. And if anyone's interested in that methodology, if you just search for City of Santa Cruz Climate Action Planning and look in the appendix of our recently adopted climate adaptation plan, it'll tell you how we did that. And there are other ways to do it, but Sylvie and others, but this is what worked for our community and the resources we had at the time. And we did get connected up to do this with Dr. Giuliano Khalil through the American Geophysicists Union's Thriving Earth Exchange. So that work was all done gratis for us and with us.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Tiffany. Does anyone else want to share how they're going about, looking at frontline communities vulnerable to climate change? Why don't I ask this? Since we do have the chat box, can people tell me if they're using CalAdapt? And then if anyone wants to, now that you're thinking about how you use CalAdapt, if you want to explain a little bit more, please chime in.
This is Matt Kubisak from Delta Stewardship Council. We mostly just look at it at a general level just for the data at the moment. But it's nice that you can find the individual smaller metrics when you look in deeper.
Hey folks, can you hear me? This is Lucy here, actually with CalAdapt, and wanted to let you all know that we're currently looking to develop new tools to serve climate planning across the state. If you go to cal-adapt.org, you'll see the call for a survey where you can type in the types of information and visualizations and data sets that might be useful to you. So know that we're always looking to evolve.
Great to have someone from CalAdapt with us. Thank you for that.
Yeah, and just let me read through what people are saying in the chat box really quick. So Tiffany Wise-West from Santa Cruz says, yes, I use CalAdapt. Delta Council, Matt Kubasic says, yes, we look at CalAdapt. Tiffany from Santa Cruz says, we've used it to update many of our hazard projections where we did not have more local specific data and integrated it into our climate adaptation plan update in 2018. Gregory C. Ira says, on a statewide level, we use CalEnviroScreen for the UC California Naturalist Program. We also use CalAdapt, but not for identifying frontline community vulnerability. Another guest says, we usually point people to a number of different resources, which includes CalAdapt, but also includes CalEnviroScreen, the CDPH Public Health Profiles of Counties, and the Healthy Places Index. And so let's actually talk about the other tool that, at least I've put these two examples here because when I'm out in the field, this is what I hear people are using. But can we hear more about other tools other than CalAdapt that people look at, like California Healthy Places Index? For example, Matt Kubasic in the chat box, he says, we also look at the Regional Opportunity Index in addition to those ones. And then BCDC has said, we use our own vulnerable communities data set, but we primarily use census data to build on it. So if anyone else wants to put in the chat box what they're using or explain more via phone, you have that option.
Hi, can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. This is Jackie at BCDC. So I have been working, we are doing a regional vulnerability assessment, looking at communities as kind of one of the focuses of our work. And I didn't put together all of the data, but have been using it. So I don't know all the details, but I do know that we use also a variety of sources. So a lot of it has looked at census data, and we've relied on another report that BCDC helped work with MPC on called Safer Housing, Stronger Communities. And they identified social vulnerability characteristics, again, based on the same methodology of census data, and really looking at combinations of characteristics and where those occur all at once. So I think that data set has something like 10 different characteristics. So low income and housing cost burdened are some of them, but they also include non-English speakers, people who are older 65 and living alone, single parents, children under 5. So really that data set was developed to look at how people may be socially vulnerable in regards to hazards. And then I think some of the people we work with have added a couple layers of not a U.S. citizen. So we kind of look at what are the kind of characteristics that may limit people's ability to either evacuate. That in that data set, it also includes people with a disability, either limits their ability to evacuate or get help, or not being able to understand emergency information if it's not in their language. We also look at it's really a compilation of different data sources, and we also include UC Berkeley's displacement risk as another factor that we look at, as well as contamination burden. So we kind of have compiled a lot of different sources to help us identify where are places around the San Francisco Bay Area that people have a lot of these characteristics all at once, and that's kind of what has guided our work in this space.
Great, that's great to hear. Thanks for sharing that. Remind me, is it, I know you're from BCDC, but remind me of your name.
I'm Jacqueline Madofsky.
Jackie, thanks, Jackie. There's been a number of people throwing in links in the chat box. Matt Kubasic from Delta Council showcased something from OPR that they put out on vulnerable communities. We're going to talk a little bit about that in the fourth question. Then BCDC said that they've pulled some indicators from CalEnviroScreen. Matt Kubasic from Delta Council says the OPR list goes what through each index contains. And then Tiffany Wise-West from Santa Cruz says, I know larger communities use SOV, and then she put the Social Vulnerability Index, and she put a link there. And then BCDC also put a link to what Jackie was mentioning about the Stronger Housing, Safer Communities work. But I think with that, I really appreciate the input we've had so far, and I'm going to move us on to the next question so that we can continue talking about all this. So the second question focuses on what are challenges or barriers to preparing frontline communities for climate impacts? When you speak, just respond to challenges and barriers for this question, because the following question will focus on effective strategies. The example from the photo is the Capital Region Urban Heat Island Mitigation Project, which administered a survey the past year. A challenge to doing outreach for a lot of frontline communities is the need to make a short survey in many different languages with relatable icons and making it easily accessible through a public website or even distributed in person. Then there is compensation for time. I know that this particular Urban Heat Island Mitigation Project survey, all participants were entered in a raffle for a $200 Visa gift card, which may have been more of an incentive to participate. So this is just an example, and now we're going to unmute the line, or I think a lot of you have been kept unmuted. And please let us know what are your challenges. And I'll read some responses that are coming in the chat, but again, please feel free to use the line since they are unmuted to speak, and we can have this as a live dialogue. But the chat responses from Tiffany Wise West from Santa Cruz are communication, building trust and relationships, making the urgency of these issues relevant when there are day-to-day challenges folks are faced with that are more immediate. Suzanne Marr says some frontline communities have a host of issues to deal with that seem more immediate. Ofei Mock says outside consultants coming in without establishing trust and relationships. Susie says, just want to say there have been various critiques of the Social Vulnerability Index, but it sort of has a monopoly on social vulnerability. I think its work using approaches like NAACP and NACRP have proposed or generally used asset-based, capital-based approaches, so not so deficit-focused. This is a lot. Sarah, do you want to respond to any of the things that people are writing in here? Oh, Sarah, you're on mute.
Yeah, thank you everyone for those. Definitely heard those through our outreach as well. I don't have too much to elaborate that aside from these are all things that we've heard about a lot, especially fostering a sense of communication and trust and relationships that are long-lasting and meaningful. And so this definitely feeds into our webinar from last week where we talked a lot about community engagement. And so it's all overlapping.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, Hofei Mock says there's a history of frontline communities giving input without having any evidence of actually being listened to or change happening. And then Lucy Andrews from CalAdapt says, I agree with the challenges of avoiding deficit focus and the commitment needed to build real partnerships and avoid paternalism. These are a lot of good comments. Does anyone want to expand on that via the phone line?
I can say one thing really quickly is that with the APG 2.0 update, something that we want to focus on is avoiding that deficit focus and really focus on the opportunity to on the opportunities to address equity in a way that's more uplifting and redesign communities that with the past in mind, but without like I'm struggling for the words that I'm wanting to use. But basically, we just want to focus on the opportunities that this new adaptation planning framework will help communities better integrate that more seamlessly.
Yeah, and I can add to that, Sarah. I think you bring up a good point where part of the, and someone, Hofe Mock also brought it up, is that I think in order to build these real, genuine partnerships with community, there has to be a acknowledgement of maybe past things that have happened in the community that weren't addressed, and to just be real with the engagement, and even in vulnerability assessment saying how there might have been disinvestment in a community for a long time, and acknowledging that, and that the path forward for this climate adaptation planning process is going to work to address that in some way. And also to just be real about commitments and what, the climate adaptation planning process will address and what it won't address. And I think that's even something that the APG 2.0 is going to have at the forefront of the document, is what it does do and what it doesn't do. So again, we're taking all of these comments that you all are putting out there in the chat box and taking them into consideration, that the APG 2.0 is going to be reflective of what you want. I'm going to read a few more comments that have came in. So Gregory C. Ira, this is from the UC Davis Naturalist Program. He says, one challenge or barrier is working through and with local community organizations that have existing relationships in place. BCDC says the structure of our organization, available funding, expertise of staff, etc., are not geared toward building long-term engagement or trust in frontline communities. There's also a lack of capacity in terms of lived experience among staff, along a lot of the types of indicators we look at to define vulnerability. Susie says, recently spoke to an evaluator who has reviewed efforts and engagement with frontline communities. Yes, there is some ignorance in not knowing now how, but there is also a big issue with trust building taking time and projects being on a fast timeline. So unless that relationship already exists, there is very little hope that this is done well from beginning to end. Also, funding goes away often before change on the ground can happen. So most important is to establish relationships and persistent structured for engagement. And then you need specific processes to deal with past legacies, past failures can be swept under the carpet. And then another guest has said, preparedness is a costly process, need more funding, need of experts on local preparedness. And so I think these are a lot of good barriers and challenges that are coming up. And it makes me want to go on to our next question, if that's okay, where we can talk about the strategies. So the third guiding question focuses on effective strategies that the community has taken to prepare frontline communities. The example given is of the Gateway Cities Council of Government Climate Funding Readiness Plan resources webpage. The Gateway Cities region in Los Angeles encompasses several small cities, and that geographic region holds the burden of the goods movement corridor and industrial pollution. Many of the small cities are having trouble competitively applying for state climate grants, even though their communities were identified as highly disadvantaged by Kalimbairo screen. So the COG stepped in to get a region-wide planning grant and provide technical assistance to 26 small cities. Having the COG take the lead rather than the smaller cities may be one effective strategy to financially preparing frontline communities. So again, now we're going to turn it over to you all to give us some feedback on what your communities are doing to effectively prepare frontline communities. And you can use the phone lines. I know a lot of you have been choosing to use the chat box.
Someone one's typing into the microphone.
Okay, since we are having some response, let me prompt some questions. So are people using the COG? So I give an example of the COG and them taking a leadership role in doing funding and getting all the prep work ready to go for smaller cities that are applying to state grants. Is anyone else using their local COG to do some similar climate adaptation work? So Tiffany Wise West says, our COG is not engaged in adaptation that I know of. And then I missed this comment from Hope Mock before, but she says community-driven planning is a way to make sure that plans are for and by frontline communities, having them identify their needs and assets and collaboratively coming up with strategies together. Sarah, do you have anything you want to add in on this? What people have been saying from the interviews or from the work group?
Yeah. Sorry, I was like, I'm having a hard time reading the chat box on my computer, so I'm looking at my colleague's computer who's right next to me. So I was going to help read those chats out. But I've heard a lot of support for regional quasi-governments to step in and support those smaller cities. I've heard a lot of that, and really understanding the regional collaborative's role in this space and to look to them for a lot of solutions and to build up partnerships. So yeah, I've heard a lot about that through many interviews and through our survey that we did. And so yeah, I'd love to hear if anyone else on the call has worked more. I know Tiffany responded. Oh, she just responded to the chat. So what she said is that the Central Coast Climate Collaborative has put equity as a central focus and is welcoming frontline communities and EJ groups free registration and offering travel stipends. Practicing equity is one of 2 major sessions at that symposium. It is all new though. It is hard to tell the impact quite yet. That's really great. Are anyone else at their agency or within their community doing something similar, like offering free registration? I know some people will do like free bus passes to get to events, like travel stipend, which he also mentioned. But yeah, I'd love to hear. More typing.
One of the things we talked about as we were debriefing the other call is I think I'm going to call on regions. So if anyone from, oh, someone speaking? So do we have anyone from the Central Valley on the line that might want to talk about what's going on in their community? No? Okay, what about the LA County, Southern California, San Diego region?
Hi, this is Iris from LA County. Sorry, hi. Yeah, I feel like I don't really have much to add because we're so early on in our process. But, we do have, we do work with SCAG, which is Southern California Association of Governments. They've been really taking the lead on providing support for adaptation that comes with funding or, applying for grant funding together with SCAG. So those are options that we will be looking at.
Yeah, thanks for sharing so much about that. I know SCAG, for example, is conducting their climate adaptation strategy, like you mentioned. So, like what Sarah and I are trying to get at is sometimes these larger regional agencies are the ones that are taking those first steps to help the smaller jurisdictions, even though I realize LA County is not small, but get started or like jumpstart these processes.
Also from the chat, say that seconding Susie's point. More chat, so I'm losing. Sorry. For millennial, I'm horrible at navigating technology. Let's see. Treat community members and their lived experiences the same way consultants and their technical expertise is valued. And then a lot of agreement to that point. Let's see. Jay Sharma, sorry if I said that wrong. We are giving out resilience grants for adaptation planning efforts. The grants place an emphasis on embedding equity into the process and building community leadership and capacity. If you're able to expound on that a little bit more, that would be great.
Yeah, is Jay Sharma on the line? If we can, I know we're picking on you, but that's an interesting point you brought up.
Like, who gets these grants?
No? Okay, Jay Sharma, we'll follow up with you after because we're really interested in your resilience grants.
Also, more from...
Is the phone line unmuted?
Yeah, all the lines should be unmuted.
I unmuted his line.
Yeah, can you guys hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Okay, I'd been speaking and I wasn't sure if my voice was reaching you.
Okay, thanks.
Not at all. Happy to share.
Oh, thank you.
I'm with the County of San Mateo here in the Bay Area, and I'm with the Office of Sustainability. We recently, or actually last year, started this effort where we give out these grants and anyone can apply for them. You could be a city, you could be a community-based organization, a nonprofit, and like any project you want to, we are calling them resilience grants. So the component is really taking on some kind of adaptation planning effort. And we specifically had 2 community-based organizations that applied last year. We had 4 cities that got the funding and 2 CBOs. One of them for the community of East Palo Alto, where they are actually pulling together what's called a climate change or a community climate change team. So it's almost like they're forming a small collaborative at the city level of core community leaders, and they're very much focused on, like, they're going to get some training on adaptation planning and like how to do vulnerability assessments, and then we'll then go out and engage the community so as to start to think through like what the community thinks their vulnerability is. We are doing some modeling for the county on like what is heat and precipitation and wildfire risks going to be, but this group is going to like really get the stories and the community perspective and their concerns, but they're going to lead on the work, like not the government or the city stepping in. And another group got a funding to do like a disaster preparedness curriculum, and they're working with youth in one of our unincorporated areas in the county. So they're going to do this training with the youth, and the youth are then going to go train other people, but they're also going to do some adult education with that as well. And within this grants, they can give out stipends. It includes money for them to like provide food or like substantial meals as people come in, and they provide stipends for folks to be there as well. So we've kept it very flexible.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. That's great. We hadn't heard that before, and so it's really great that you're doing that, but then also that you can share it for us to maybe follow up on for the APG 2.0.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give you the link of the website where you can find out more about these specific projects. But then, yeah, please feel free to reach out to me.
Thank you. And I'm going to read some of the other things that have come into the chat. So Hofe Mock says, it's also important that agency staff and consultants undergo training on privilege and understanding the impact of systemic oppression, racism, ableisms, how policy has been historically implemented to marginalized communities. Hofe Mock, if you're on the line, do you want to expand on that more?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, yes, I can.
Hi.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Yeah, I was just thinking that it's great that people are starting to become more aware of the issues of equity, but I think like what's really important when you're dealing with just different types of frontline communities is to understand like what we as people of power are bringing in with us. So there's a lot of not just the historical stuff, but also just like our own positions of power, depending on like who you are. It could be like our racial identities, our gender identities, our whether we're like able-bodied or not. So it's really important to be able to like understand how those kind of like power dynamics play in on how people are or aren't able to speak up when they're in a conversation with folks. So that's one piece. And then the other piece is understanding how we're not just talking about like planning within the current circumstances, but also how it builds upon those historical like things that happened in the past with frontline communities, like histories of redlining or with displacement or genocide, those kind of things. I think it's really important to be able to understand that history.
Yeah, and are you able to recommend some training? Like I've heard of GARE.
GARE's one. I think off the top of my head. I think it will probably be easier for me to send afterwards.
Sure.
There definitely are a lot, and it's hard to kind of just recommend like one or two because there's so many different starting points for a lot of these kind of topics. And yeah, so I think I'll follow up.
That sounds good. Yeah, and Sarah has said in the email that she sent out earlier this morning that she's still taking comments and feedback, after this webinar. And the other thing I want to say is you bring up a good point, and it gets me thinking to how we integrate this into the APG 2.0. And I mean, if that's something we're recommending to all these cities that are working with frontline communities or community that getting training to their staff and consultants on how to reach marginalized communities and to understand the impact of systemic oppression, racism, ableism, like that could possibly be in the APG 2.0, that these trainings should be a part of the adaptation planning process. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I definitely think that would be good to incorporate. I guess one general point that should be made is if there are going to be recommendations made on specific organizations to go with, is to prioritize those that are being run for or by frontline communities. And I mean, I guess there are some benefits of white people talking to white people, but if we are going to pay and for the emotional labor of folks, then it should be to the frontline communities that are being impacted.
Yeah. Thanks, Jofe. I'm going to move on to Susie's comment. So Susie in the chat box wrote, "It strikes me we need some ways to better track our own history. A few years back, USC Sea Grant did a report on vulnerability and elicited a social vulnerability report. Lots of engagement with frontline neighborhoods followed. Also some training of city counties, officials in social vulnerability. This happens again and again. People feeling that they start from scratch, but a lot has actually happened. How do we build institutional memory or maintain it if staff change? That's part of maintaining relationships with EJ communities." So I'm going to throw it back to Susie and see if she wants to explain that a little bit more.
Hi, this is Susie. So what I've observed is, and this is not just in California, I observe it everywhere, that basically people, keep saying they are starting for the first time to do adaptation, and they've been actually, when you look back at the history, someone in that same region has been at it for over the last 15 plus years. And every time you jumpstart relationships and every time you encounter that the group that you try to connect with is really upset that nothing happened previously, and then, people are just like, well, I don't know how we're going to do it. And it takes more time every single time to actually rebuild that trust, or, it's going to be different this time, right? And then the money goes away and never anything happens. So there is some ways in which the approach we've taken and the fact that we lose this institutional memory actually makes the problem worse. So in LA, someone just mentioned that, they're just so early in the process. It's not true. I mean, we have actually had a lot of work in that area. Apparently it involves new people every time, and that's problematic. People get burned out from not being, that you have to start every time, or that nothing happens, and that they get approached again and again by different people. Somehow, as part of this guidance, we need to somehow build in mechanisms that builds that institutional memory, so we don't tap the same people all the time, we don't overburden them, and we don't forget that there actually is a history. So it feels to me like we need to start making a dent in the systemic problem as we're trying to improve in an immediate process right now. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does, Susie. It makes so much sense. I think that especially when people are so limited on time, like this is one of the last things like on their plate, but they actually care about it. They care about the issue. And it sucks to be burned by an agency that, you think you're getting input, but then it's not followed up on. I totally get it. I think that I'm going to turn it over to Sarah and see if she has anything she wants to respond with. But then also, I want to follow up with you, Susie, and see if there's any solution or like what you've seen has been something that's worked. And then you can talk a little bit about that.
Mm-hmm. So who's first?
Sarah.
I'll just quickly say that thank you for that point. We talked about that last week at our first listening session on communication, collaboration, and coalition building, which definitely overlaps into this topic. They're like, you can't have one without the other. And that is something that we've heard time and time again throughout our outreach, is just maintaining that institutional knowledge and those relationships. And so thank you for really like bringing that home for us again. So I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, so I guess that, I don't know of a place that has sort of instituted a way to do that, but if we're assuming that we're going to do an adaptation for the next 3,000 years, why not start a file, where you just track, met with such and such person today, whatever, because it's no one's fault, right? You come into a position, you have no idea what happened before, you're trying to do your best, And if there was such a file you could pick up on, I mean, that would just go such a long way to begin to at least, quickly climb the learning curve and figure out what's gone before. And, not everything happens in the same office, right? So it might be the city and then the county does something separately. But, maybe this is the part of a responsibility or something that the regional collaboratives could do. I don't know, Tiffany, maybe you want to talk to that. But it's some way of like building a history so that someone who comes into a job just has a place to ask, anybody know what happened here before I start knocking on doors? I think that would be helpful.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Can you introduce
Hi,
yourself?
this is Suzanne Marr at the EPA. Here we call it institutional memory. Maybe some of the rest of you use that as well. So maybe there's something you folks could do in suggesting, the things that can go into such a file, whether it's electronic or hard copy, and be shared with others that are in the group you're working with. So maybe actually the community members will also hold some of the, the file or a copy of the file. And so they might actually end up, the residents might be the holders of institutional memory. As Susie, I think you're actually implying anyway. So, maybe there's stuff that can be shared about best practices.
Getting some feedback. Might want to.
I think someone's flush with new experience there.
Okay. Well, I had started this in the beginning, and then we actually got some people talking, but I am still going to go around and call on different regions just so that people feel like they've had the chance to speak. So do we have anyone from like the Sierra Nevada region? We had someone last time that was really good during the listening session. So just want to make sure they're represented if they are on the call. No. What about the North Coast region? North of the Bay Area and north of Sacramento. Or sorry, just the north North Coast, but then north of Sacramento as well. Okay. Well, I'll just open it up generally again, because I know we've had representatives talk from other parts of like Southern California, the Central Coast, and just want to make sure that people are getting their points across. So before we move on from this question, does anyone have anything that they want to add?
This is Tiffany from Santa Cruz, and I just want to say how much I've learned from this particular discussion. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Tiffany. We're learning a lot from you too in City of Santa Cruz.
Thanks.
Hi, this is this is Jackie from BCDC. I'll just add something quickly. We've done some initial community engagement. I think we have a long way to go, but just some things I think that worked well in the limited time we have. I mean, barriers are, of course, funding and just the ability to have the funding and mechanisms to really be there long term. But in the work that we have done is just really making an effort, being there, showing up, listening, being supportive to the communities, really asking what the communities want and need, and just building trust and really listening and doing the best that we could for them. And so far that I think we've built a good relationship. There's a lot more challenges to how much further we can go, but I think that has worked really well. It's just being really genuine when you're working with people.
Hi, Alex Guinness from World Institute on Disability here. And just from the disability standpoint, actually, there's a couple of things. First of all is that there are a lot of groups that are focused on kind of acute climate impacts, and for us, certainly inclusive adaptive or disaster readiness and response, which OES has been really awesome with their access and functional needs staff over there, and working with staff and community leaders who are already addressing specific climate-related impacts, such as acute natural disasters, and collaborating with them to expand that into a more climate change long-term contextual framework is valuable for kind of bringing on existing momentum on specific topics and then turning into a climate justice framework. And the second thing that comes to mind is, and I think this is worthwhile for a lot of frontline communities, is to bring up the kind of intersectional aspects of vulnerability. Whereas, we say that, okay, disability is present in every other community and population. There is kind of intersection and then higher rates of disability in already identified frontline communities, communities of color, low-income communities, also senior populations, things like that. And that we can kind of raise the profile of those almost doubly vulnerable groups and populations, and bring them on board and highlight that, and then not only address the excess vulnerability, but then build more of a mutually supportive and active network across all different types of frontline communities.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing. And do you have a link too that you can also just put in the chat box if we should be, looking to the resources your organization has developed already?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, I'd point people. I'll do ours. We're constantly updating the resources on the website, but OES has an access and functional needs library, and I'll find that link and paste it in, because that's really fantastic for kind of more direct guidance as well.
Thank you. And then I'm going to read a couple of other things that have come in the chat box. From Lucy Andrews, she's saying, in particular, those fields outside the domain of many planners, developing some education on trauma through reading and training, maybe with a somatics focus, could be helpful. People are both brain and body, and that shows up in climate adaptation work. Thanks, Lucy, for bringing that up. And if you do have a link, I think people have been really good about sharing links in the chat box. So please put a link in there about some education on trauma if you have it. And then people asked what GARE is. So GARE is the Government Alliance of Race Equity, and I know that they're an organization that has been training both state agencies and local governments across the nation, but they've done some stuff here in California that's been really well recognized and really helpful in outreaching to communities that are more marginalized. Suzanne Marr said institutional memory, but she explained on that a little bit more. And then Tiffany Wise West, she said, what about using Adaptation Clearinghouse as a long-term record, failing no other way to do so? Do you want to explain on that, Tiffany?
Yeah, folks were talking about how some work gets done, and then somehow, folks try to pick that up, but there may not be a way for them to understand where things left off, so they're starting over again, causing frustration with the folks that had already kind of provided input rather, and using the Adaptation Clearinghouse to maybe document your work to the extent that you can, not only provides examples for other people, but can somewhat serve as that institutional memory. But that, of course, means that we all have to institutionalize using the clearinghouse. So anyway, just a thought.
Yeah, thank you. I think with that, we're going to move to the next question because it builds on what the state is already doing and how it can continue to support. Oh, you know what? No, we're not. We still have another question. Let's go, to question number 4. So this one is really specific, and we just want to know that there have been these couple of laws that have come out And the first one is SB 379, which I had mentioned earlier. It's a recent law that requires jurisdictions to have climate resilience in the safety element of the general plan or local hazard mitigation plan. And then SB 1000 complements this law by requiring the consideration of environmental justice goals and objectives in the general plan. Since these are fairly new laws, the Governor's Office of Planning and Research has provided some guidance, and the state plans to do more with APG 2.0. But there are some great examples of how jurisdictions can comply with both SB 379 and SB 1000 in this toolkit that was developed by PlaceWorks and the California Environmental Justice Alliance. And so I just put that there and link it because I think it does a good job of showing how climate resilience and environmental justice are linked, and we should be thinking about those communities when we're planning. So with that, I just want to get people's perspective on SB 379 or SB 1000.
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
In reading SB 1000, it appears to say that it's only required to do an environmental justice element if you are simultaneously amending two elements of your general plan. Is that true? So if you do one element and then the following year you do another, then that's a loophole in the law?
I don't know if we have anyone from OPR on the line. Do you know, Sarah?
Should not be the one to speak on that. I don't want to give any misguidance, but I'm not sure if we have anyone from OPR on the line.
Can you follow up with us about that specific question?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, cool. Who's the one speaking?
This is Jack Leapster from Marin County.
Yes, please follow up with us because we don't want to misguide you on when you shouldn't be and when you should be updating it. Anyone else want to put in the chat box how their jurisdiction has been, looking at updating the general plan to include both climate resilience and environmental justice? It's one of the things that I think is the hardest part, and the person who spoke before, we think it is a good question that you brought up, and we're hoping that the APG 2.0 will provide really specific guidance to how to comply with these laws both simultaneously. So we put this question in the listening session to see if people have already started to do their compliance efforts or their general plan updates for this. But it is a fairly new process, so we don't expect too many in-depth answers. And Sarah, do you want to add anything to this question?
Yeah, I cannot speak. I was just going to encourage folks even to just share their confusion around the topic or the Senate bills through our outreach. In our local, we did some interviews with local practitioners, and they're just not sure how to go about 379. And so we're trying to identify some themes of confusion implementing these. So that would be great to hear any of your struggles. We don't have answers right now, or we don't want to speak out of turn, but we do want to just hear and collect the themes so we can ensure that we're creating or addressing these topics in the APG how best we can, and that speaks to people's confusion.
Hi, this is Iris from LA County. So we are starting to update our safety element per SB 379, and I would say the guess the difficult part is approaching the vulnerability assessment. And I think it would be great if APG or the next iteration of APG gave more guidance as to how, I guess, which methodology we should be using to assess these, vulnerability or climate impacts. I feel like right now there's a lot of resources out there, but making the choice or determining which one is the right one, it's a little overwhelming. And so if the state can give us, a clearer direction as to, the methodology we should use, and then it would be consistent throughout the region as well.
Got it. Thank you, Iris. Anyone else have something they want to add? Any other planners on the call?
This is Tiffany. I work with our planning department, and we integrated climate adaptation and our vulnerability assessment into our approved LHMP that was adopted at the same time as our adaptation plan last year. And also our planning department later in the year is starting on the safety element and is going to incorporate there. It is my understanding that if you don't have disadvantaged communities within your jurisdiction, you're not required to do the environmental justice element, but that could be an area of concern that you may want to flag also. And then lastly, on the topic of vulnerability assessments and methodologies, I just want to let folks know that the Regional Resilience Building Toolkit that talks about how to do vulnerability assessments and even how to do them in-house with rapid risk assessment kind of framework has just come out, that was developed with EPA, FEMA, lots of other groups. ABAG, the Central Coast Climate Collaborative, was involved in testing it, as I believe a group in the Sierras was. And you can check that out at centralcoastclimate.org. We have a link to the EPA website. It just dropped this week if folks are interested.
Thanks, Tiffany.
Can I add on something to Tiffany's on the tool, the vulnerability assessment tool? I think it would be potentially misleading to give advice of which one tool to use. I think it would be much more helpful to provide sort of a pros and cons, or something like, this tool does this, but it doesn't do this, and it's recommended for situations like X, whatever, a little bit like a tool to, or a guide as to how to pick among the many tools out there that is, clearly related to the sort of decisions that a planner needs to make as to, why are we doing this, and for what time frame do we need it, and, what do we really want to know?
I strongly agree with that, Susie.
This is Faye. I just want to add on that APN just recently came out with a report on assessing different tools on their equity indicator use, and like how well they're able to capture climate vulnerabilities for frontline communities. I don't believe the report is out online yet, so they have to reach out specifically to Ami Raval at APEN for a copy of the report. But I think that would be a good starting point because it does have a good overview of the different pros and cons of the different tools.
Hi, Jose. This is Natalie. I just linked to the report. There is, like you mentioned, that there's a CBO-led, tool that's being used, or not tool, report that was done, and it recently got released. And it oversees and it just analyzes a lot of the different climate vulnerability frameworks out there if you want to see what they're doing. I know I'm going to look through it and see how it relates to APG 2.0. But anyways, I linked it in the chat so that people have it as a resource. Because it just got uploaded to their website last week.
Would you be able to send these links to us by email? There's so many links in the chat box right now. So.
Yes,
Sarah,
I
what do you
will.
think?
Yes, definitely. I'm gonna take them all and send them out once we're have all of our notes done. So all participants will get a copy of the notes, all these links, and then a link to the recording of this if they wanted to go back as well. So give me about a week and you'll have that in your inbox.
Thanks.
And then Sarah, I want to go to the last question.
Yeah.
So a lot of people have already chimed in on this, and it's been great because I think as we've moved along the questions, you've given us ideas on what we should be putting into the APG 2.0, like whether that's links to different race and like ableism trainings, or if that's like a pro and con list on what vulnerability assessments we should be looking at, or if it's you know, more guidance on SB 379. I think all of this we've been taking note of and is really important. So we want to hear more about how the state can provide guidance in APG 2.0 and ensure equity is embedded in the local planning adaptation processes. One of the things that we're considering doing is looking to ICARP's document, which I showed there, and how it defines vulnerable communities in the context of climate adaptation. So that's just one example, and you all have given us a lot of other examples, but I'll just open it up now for people that, since we have about 15 more minutes left, for people to chime in and give us more feedback.
This is Suzanne Mart, EPA. Just real quick, are you guys asking some equity questions with tribes in California as well?
Hello?
Are we asking them questions in the APG?
Yeah, you know, you're asking questions of the non-tribal communities about how they're doing equity within their own communities, which makes a lot of sense. But I'm just wondering if someone there is reaching out to tribes as well.
That's a great question. Sarah, do you want to respond to that?
So we have had tribal engagement through our outreach and our local practitioner interviews, and we also have the tribal liaison at Cal OES who participating in our work group and helping us with that outreach. And so there's two tribal liaisons here at OES, and they were activated. And so we didn't do as much tribal outreach as we wanted due to all the fires. But that's something that we're gonna put a strong emphasis on now that they're no longer activated or as busy once we have the public review draft out and finalized. But the APG, the users, the target audience include tribal governments as a primary audience.
And if you want to have any discussion on that, give me a call. If you want any other advice on who might be good contacts in the state. So I'll send you an email, Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that.
This is Tiffany, and on that topic of contacts, I have to say I find myself having a really difficult time starting from scratch, trying to build, potentially affected interests in groups and their contacts. And I know it's very difficult when, we're so localized and so forth, but any kind of like guidance on how to contact people and for different underrepresented groups would be appreciated.
Thank you, Tiffany.
You're welcome.
Anyone else want to chime in? Either via chat or via the phone lines? Well, now I'll ask, does anyone have any questions for us? Since everyone has stayed on, we've had about up to 50 people on this call, and we appreciate your attention, but these are the questions we came up with that we thought could really guide the conversation. But are there anything, since we do have a few minutes and since people are still on the line, that you want to ask of us?
How's it going so far? How are you guys feeling about the progress and what you're coming up with?
Sarah, you want to respond?
Yeah, I think it's going really well. All the feedback that we've gotten from folks across the state and all the regions has just been really great perspective and really informative. And the level of interest and involvement from folks, including all of you on the call, has been, to me, very motivational and inspiring, and makes me confident this document's going to be really useful to folks.
And any surprises?
Surprises. I mean, I'm a Civic Spark Fellow, and so I feel like, to me, there's a lot of surprises because it's been, being on such a project's been such a learning curve, but I don't know from the perspective of OES, our consultant team, if there's been major surprises. I think from my perspective of the project management team, we're all sailing the ship in one direction and it's going well. But Natalie, please say anything if you have a difference of opinion.
No, it seems like stuff has been going really well. And I know as a member of the consultant team, I've been very much pushing that this document is going to be co-owned by many of the people who have been contributing, like yourselves. I think at the end of the day, like, it's not for us, it's for you all. And so I'm very happy that you are taking the time to kind of create it, co-create it with us as you're giving us all this feedback and pointing us to different resources that we're going to be able to share across the state. So I really love outreach and the work that I do, and it just makes me really happy that we can have you all be a part of it, because it's your document. It's your document at the end of the day that you can use and share with colleagues.
This is Susie. Can I ask another question?
Of course.
So, in this call, we talked a lot about partnerships and the sort of, importance of building those. I'm wondering if you could give us a little bit more of a sense of, are you recommending something around partnership building and what sectors? I think it would be dangerous if we only focused on sort of partnering with EJ communities and, the risk of overusing maybe the groups, given all they have on their plates already. So I'm just wondering, it's a fine balance, obviously, in that particular regard, in terms of how much you ask of them, how much you try to improve in your own practices and so on. So it gets a little bit back to the stuff that Hoya was saying earlier. But I'm just wondering what other partnerships you're proposing people look into in this guidance.
That's a really great question, and thank you for that. And that's something that we talked about last week in last week's webinar, building coalitions, particularly around within your jurisdiction or your agency. And so often I feel like silos are the biggest issue, one of the biggest issues in this space, and avoiding duplication of effort and resources. And so we're going to really focus on, or what we're trying to focus on is that cross-department collaboration and communication. So having the emergency managers talk to the planners and having public works involved as like equal partnership, and also neighboring communities, so city to neighboring city, and also next week at our webinar, tomorrow's webinar, we're going to talk a little bit about fostering that public-private partnerships, and so that could be a way to help alleviate or navigate the funding issues often that come along with doing this work. And so basically, in short, to your answer, fostering partnerships and collaboration with everyone possible, because we need all hands on deck to adapt to this climate crisis. So, Yeah, thank you for that question. Natalie, do you want to add anything?
No, that was a great response, Sarah.
Can I build on to it?
Yes.
So I don't want to hog the thing here, but I'm a little bit on a mission of getting the adaptation world be trauma informed. And one of the areas that is so consistently overlooked are the psychological dimensions of climate change, in particular after disastrous events, but not only. I mean, Sonoma and it's happened up in Paradise are good examples, but it's true everywhere. I'm working with a lot of people who are essentially burnt out and fried and don't have a lot of hope, and it's just overwhelming. And I think we overlook this because it's such a societal taboo to talk about those needs. And one of the things I'm working with several federal agencies is to actually build relationships with mental health providers into the front end, like now, building those relationships now as opposed to when something really bad happens, because at that point, it's just overwhelming what is needed. And so I think for local governments to become aware of that need and to start building that into building memoranda of understanding or whatever with healthcare providers, I think is a really important piece.
Yeah, that's so important. Again, if you can point us to some links that you think might be helpful, that would be great.
Unfortunately, there aren't any.
Oh, okay. I was going to say
there aren't any
health.
Because it's, yeah. I mean, there is a lot of stuff on mental health, but and there are some efforts now out there, but it's a really breaking new ground kind of area. And I mean, there are some good groups in California, and I guess I can send you those later.
Sure. I mean, because mental health and trauma hasn't come up yet in our outreach. I think you're one of the few people on the listening sessions who's brought it up, and I do think it's really important. I think that these disasters that happen, whether it's like wildfires or extreme heat events, it's very preoccupying, very anxiety-inducing, and especially when people, they may not like be physically hurt, but they're very traumatized, or they can't think well after the disasters, and that's something that we have to be prepared for. So I think there is a space for it in the adaptation planning guide as far as really pointing people to resources. And so we'll take your feedback into consideration.
Great, thanks.
And then Susie wants to know, will you provide your emails so that we can send you more info? I think the best person to send it to is Sarah. Sarah, do you want to put your email in the chat box?
Yes.
Yeah, but Sarah
Yes, please feel free to email me with any information or questions.
There we go. And then one last thing that I want to read from the chat box. Whitney, let me go up a little bit. Whitney asked, is this the new framework for building regional resilience? And then she put a link to the regional framework. I don't know Whitney, but we'll look into that. Tiffany Wise West says, I'd like to invite you all to our Central Coast Climate Collaborative annual symposium on August 14th in SLO to continue this conversation. She put an Eventbrite link in the chat. And then Whitney says, it would be helpful if APG 2.0 contained guidance on how to integrate the numerous existing planning documents many jurisdictions already have that pertain to climate resiliency and hazard assessments. And then Kevin Rolfness from HCD says, like an RTP and SCS. I'm not sure.
I don't know those acronyms.
Oh, RTP is the Regional Transportation Plan. SCS is the Sustainable Strategy.
Okay. Yeah, I think plan alignment or plan integration is a huge piece to the APG. So you can definitely expect guidance around that. It seems like all these documents are moving in one direction. And there's just a lot there. We talk a lot, we nerd about that here in the office about how to better align and integrate. And so I'm excited for the APG to provide guidance around that topic. We have 2 more minutes. If there's any like lingering last minute questions, sorry to cut you off, Natalie.
No, I was just going to say, can you please let people know about tomorrow's?
Oh, yes. So tomorrow is our last of 3 listening sessions. And we're focusing on, we're going to talk more. The topic for tomorrow is making climate adaptation planning a local process. And so we're going to talk through what it looks like on the ground level and how it operates on the ground level. And we're going to talk more about the new phased approach that I presented earlier. What am I missing on that?
Public-private partnerships.
Yes, and private-public partnerships, and really how those can be developed and enhanced. Oh gosh, it's a Monday. There's so much information in my brain.
How those can help, I think, with the planning process, because there's a lot of unfunded work in this right now. And so we're finding that private partners are the ones that sometimes have the money to jumpstart these efforts.
Mm-hmm. And they're also looking to get engaged as well. We've heard that a lot in our outreach, and so we're trying to bring them more as key actors in this space. So, yeah. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining today. We definitely hope you can join tomorrow. We think it'll be another great conversation. We're taking all of your input, putting it into notes, as Natalie said. Gave us a lot to think about and a lot of great resources. So, yeah, thank you. Natalie, anything from you?
No, just see you all tomorrow if you're going to be on the webinar listening session.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.